Welcome back to the third session of Gold, Goats, and Justice, a study on some of the stories that shape who we are as Christians. Like always, if you haven't taken a few minutes to read through today's story and talk through it with your group, please do pause this video and take some time for that. Now, today's story is honestly one of the harder ones of Jesus to decipher. In fact, if you read through a handful of commentaries on this passage, many scholars are going to admit that this story has been one of the more challenging ones for us to grasp the significance of. So let's just get right to it and see if we can't make sense of it for ourselves. In our story today, Jesus tells us about a guy who's getting fired from his job, and he said, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.'" Basically, what you've got is a rich guy who is paying someone else to manage his investments, and this investment manager was doing a poor job. So the rich man came and said, "Hey, you're fired. I need you to go get all of your accounts of your management and bring them to me." Now, to this manager, this was terrible news. He says to himself, "What shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. Well, I've decided what I'll do, so that when I'm removed from management, people will receive me into houses." So he summoned all of his master's debtors one by one, and he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. So he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. Now, this part is where the story gets so confusing, because what seems to us to be some shady actions on the part of the manager, Jesus frames as a positive example for us. Jesus says, "The master commanded the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light." Now, this is one of those areas where the cultural difference between us and Jesus puts us at a real disadvantage. There were just some cultural practices that the original readers of this story understood that are typically lost to us today. And one of those practices has to do with how commissions worked for someone like the manager. The most plausible way to understand this story is simply that the amounts that this manager was cutting from those bills would have likely been the amount that his commission would end up being once the bills were paid. So what he's doing is essentially sacrificing his immediate cut in those sales in effort to build relationships that would benefit him once his job is gone. He wants to be able to go to these people and say, "Hey, do you remember when I took care of you? Now it's your turn to take care of me." Well, his wealthy employer sees what he did and essentially says, "You may have been dishonest in the way that you worked for me, but you sure are shrewd and know how to invest in your future." Which makes sense when we hear Jesus' application of the story. Jesus said, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." Jesus' point is this: the dishonest manager acted in light of what he knew was coming. He knew he would be fired, so he acted shrewdly, finding a way to make his current resources help him in the future. The point Jesus is making towards his followers is this: if the dishonest manager was able to act shrewdly, using what was available to him now to invest in his future, why can't you? The implication being that just like the dishonest manager knew what awaited him, every person should know what awaits them. We are all going to have to give an account for how we used our resources before God. The question is, will we use what we've been given in a way that invests in our eternal life? Or will we use what we've been given and let it be a distraction that keeps us from focusing on God's priorities for our life. That's why Jesus continues on in this teaching by saying in verse 10, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Jesus is hearkening to the reality that none of what you own is ultimately yours. Every penny, every sock, every dish in your cabinet, and piece of clothing in your closet is simply part of the vast array of resources that God has entrusted to you to manage. And this story is encouraging us to manage these resources in a way that invests in our future eternity rather than just our here and now. This leaves us with one big question. What does it look like to manage our resources in a way that invests in eternity? Well, I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this question, but Jesus does tell us another story that helps us think through this. This is Luke chapter 21. It says, "Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than any of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on.'" Now, one of the themes of Jesus' teachings is how following him is an entire life endeavor. When we come to Jesus, we give our entire selves to him and try and align all that we do with his purposes and priorities. That means that when it comes to our money, we are not just being generous with whatever extra we have here and there. We are trying to let the ways of Jesus inform every part of how we use our money, from where we live to how we invest, to what our budget looks like, to how much we give away. Now, you're going to have some time to talk through this with your group, but let me leave you with this thought. Jesus said, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." So if you have not been trustworthy handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? The resources that Jesus has entrusted to us are one of the ways that he is giving us the opportunity to learn to practice faithfulness to him. So what does it look like for you to be trustworthy in handling what God has given to you? We'll see you next week.